Revolutions are supposed to bring change, right? A chance to wipe the slate clean and create something better. But what if I told you that 50% of revolutions fail? Not just that, they often end up in worse situations than before. You heard that right. Imagine the promise of freedom, only to end up with more oppression. Take the French Revolution, for example. It started with cries for liberty, but it ended with the Reign of Terror, where thousands lost their lives. Or think about the Soviet Union. The Bolsheviks promised equality, but Stalin's rule turned it into a brutal dictatorship. This happens more often than we realize. In this video, we'll dive into the surprising truth behind revolutions. We'll uncover why many revolutions don't live up to their promises, how some leaders end up becoming the very oppressors they once fought against, and why certain movements simply fade into history. Stick around, what you'll discover might change how you see history and revolutions forever. Chapter 1: The Revolution Mirage. What looks like change. Revolutions often look like the solution to everything that's wrong. When the people rise, they promise freedom, equality, and a brighter future. But are these promises real, or just illusions? Take the French Revolution, for example. It started with the cries of liberty, fraternity, and equality, yet it ended in the Reign of Terror. Thousands were executed, and the power ended up in the hands of Napoleon. The original goals were lost in the chaos. In many revolutions, the aftermath looks eerily similar to the regime they replaced. It's a pattern seen throughout history. According to political theorist Karl Marx, revolutions should pave the way for a classless society, but often, those who seize power just form a new elite. The Russian Revolution promised equality, but Stalin's rise brought more repression than the Tsars ever did. Statistically, most revolutions don't result in the changes they hope for. A study by the University of Michigan found that about 50% of revolutions fail, while only 10% lead to lasting reform. This shows that the aftermath of a revolution often doesn't meet expectations. What's even more surprising is that in many cases, the old system is rebuilt, only in a different form. The revolutionary dream can be a mirage. It's easy to think that with the fall of an oppressive government, everything will automatically improve. But the reality is more complex. Sometimes, the revolutionaries themselves become what they once hated. Chapter 2: Revolutionary Euphoria. The highs and the lows. The first days of a revolution are full of energy. There's hope, optimism, and the promise of a better world. This euphoria, however, doesn't last long. As soon as the dust settles, reality kicks in. Take the American Revolution, for instance. While it was a beacon of liberty, it didn't immediately grant freedom to everyone. Slavery continued for nearly a century afterward, and Native American lands were still being taken. Revolutionaries often get swept up in the moment. They may genuinely believe they can build a new world. But the transition from revolutionary fervor to governing is tricky. As political strategist Machiavelli warned, those who gain power through force often struggle to hold on to it. One interesting fact: 70% of revolutions in history failed to meet the original goals of their movements. This is often because the leaders were more focused on seizing power than on creating long-term solutions. Many revolutions, like the Cuban Revolution, found themselves dealing with economic collapse and political isolation shortly after their initial success. In the early days, there's an overwhelming feeling of, "We're changing the world." But then, the weight of leadership begins to take a toll. Revolutionaries can lose sight of their goals. Instead of creating equality, they may end up creating a new, smaller group of elites. This cycle of revolution and failure is almost a given in history. Chapter 3: The Inverted Revolution. How leaders become the oppressors. One of the most fascinating aspects of revolutions is how leaders can become the very thing they once opposed. It's called the inverted revolution. The leaders of revolutions often come to power promising freedom and equality, but quickly revert to authoritarian tactics. Take Vladimir Lenin, for example. He led the Bolshevik Revolution, promising a workers' paradise. But under his rule, Russia became a one-party state with brutal repression of any opposition. Another famous case is Fidel Castro. He led the Cuban Revolution in 1959, which sought to overthrow the corrupt Batista regime. Castro promised democracy, but Cuba ended up with a dictatorship where dissent was violently suppressed. These are not isolated incidents, either. Historically, revolutionaries often struggle to reconcile the ideal of freedom with the demands of power. In fact, George Orwell, who was a staunch critic of totalitarianism, argued that every revolution only replaces one set of rulers with another. It's a sobering thought. The same tactics that help revolutionaries seize power often become the tools of oppression once they are in charge. When revolutions succeed, the new leaders often face the same dilemmas as their predecessors. How do you maintain control? How do you build a stable society after chaos? These challenges lead many revolutionary leaders to adopt authoritarian methods, ultimately making them indistinguishable from those they replaced. Don't forget to subscribe if you're enjoying this deep dive into the dark side of revolutions. You won't want to miss what's next. Chapter 4: The Forgotten Rebels. Why some movements failed to thrive, some revolutions fade into history unnoticed. While major revolutions like the French and American ones dominate the narrative, many smaller movements struggle to make a lasting impact. These forgotten rebels often lack the resources, the momentum, or the right timing to achieve their goals. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956 is a perfect example. It was a national uprising against Soviet control, but it was crushed by Soviet tanks within weeks. The revolutionaries' dreams were squashed, and their names largely disappeared from history. The revolution might have had potential, but it was too small, too isolated, and too easily suppressed. Statistically, most revolutions fail because of this. According to a report from the International Peace Institute, 80% of revolutions that don't have broad, widespread support end in failure. Without international backing or mass mobilization, it's nearly impossible for a revolution to succeed. Even when smaller movements win, they often fail to capitalize on their success. In the case of Nicaragua's Sandinista revolution, the initial overthrow of the Somoza dictatorship was celebrated. But soon after, the Sandinistas faced internal divisions and external opposition, which eventually led to their downfall. In many cases, the revolutionaries themselves become part of the problem. They may lose focus or fail to unite behind a single goal. It's these movements that often slip through the cracks of history, leaving only the echo of their initial hope. Chapter 5: Revolutions 2.0. Are we seeing a new kind of success? In today's world, revolutions look different. With the rise of social media, movements can spread faster than ever before. The Arab Spring is a prime example. What started as a series of protests in Tunisia quickly spread to countries like Egypt, Libya, and Syria. For a brief moment, it looked like a new kind of revolution was possible, a revolution in the digital age. But here's the catch: while these movements were swift, they didn't always achieve lasting change. In Egypt, for example, the 2011 protests ousted President Hosni Mubarak. But a few years later, Egypt saw the rise of an even more authoritarian regime under Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. Data shows that digital revolutions are double-edged swords. A study from the Oxford Internet Institute found that social media can help organize protests quickly, but it's not as effective in sustaining long-term political change. The ease of mobilizing people online doesn't translate into real-world political power or a lasting shift in governance. Despite this, new tools have created new possibilities. Modern revolutions might not look like the French or Russian uprisings, but they are redefining what success means. Movements like Black Lives Matter or the protests in Hong Kong have used the digital age to amplify their voices in ways past movements couldn't. It's a whole new kind of revolution, one that challenges traditional methods and aims to bring change without the same old patterns of power struggles. Chapter 6: Revolutionary Cycles. Can true change ever stick? Even when revolutions succeed in achieving their goals, history shows that they often come full circle. The success of one revolution often sets the stage for the rise of another. Take the Iranian Revolution of 1979. It ended a monarchy, but it led to the establishment of a theocratic regime that some argue is just as oppressive. The cycles of revolutions can be tracked in data. The Transitions to Democracy database, compiled by political scientists, shows that nearly 30% of revolutions in the 20th century have led to a second revolution within 15 years. This indicates that revolutions often create new dissatisfaction, leading to more upheaval. The revolutionary cycle is hard to break. Once a regime is toppled, the expectations for a better system can clash with reality. Leaders find themselves caught in a web of promises they can't keep, or they quickly become entrenched in the same power dynamics they once fought against. The cycle itself raises an important question: can true, lasting change ever happen through revolution? Some historians argue that real change requires more than just overthrowing a government, it requires a complete societal shift. That shift might take generations, not just months or years. If you enjoyed these insights into the nature of revolutions, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more in-depth discussions like this one.